Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be with you here in South Tyrol. And this presentation is going to be probably as much of a surprise for me as it is for you because I sent the slides through last week. So hopefully we'll be able to have some vague, but it's all about dealing with anticipation and uncertainty of the future. And on that note, I just wanted to make a formal request to the organizers, bearing in mind that it's the South Africa-Mexico kickoff this evening. So I hope that our dinner will be in time for me to be able to cheer Bafana on. So it was also fantastic to have the initial presentations from the three speakers earlier because they really set the scene for what I'm going to be sort of building on for this. And that's in essence just acknowledging, as Jeroen was saying, that imagination that the future is political, it is contested. And so how can we go about providing some of these alternative futures that come from more marginalized places, but also taking the sort of that critical creativity into account that Idil was also mentioning, and talking to the types of processes around futures making that Luigi spoke to. So always a fun thing. Okay. There was a mention of science fiction, speculative fiction earlier, and so I really like opening with this quote by William Gibson about the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And I think that that's both in the sense of those preferable, desirable, aspirational, preposterous futures that we want to see happen, but also some of the really dystopian, problematic ones that we want to avoid, and they are around us at this moment in time. And so just acknowledging that there's this tight connection, and Jeroen gave that really important figure that was connecting multiple pasts into these multiple presents that help us sort of think through these multiple futures. This is sort of one way of thinking about that. But when we talk about aspirational futures, preferable futures, if I were to ask everyone in this room to just close their eyes and imagine a world in 2100 where we got things right, what would that look like to you? What would this region look like? What does it mean to get things right? What would transport look like? What would we be eating? The building? Would we be housewives ordering our meals in as as Jeroen was mentioning? And for me, and I work in this field, that's really hard to do. For those who still have their eyes closed, you can open them or you can continue to sleep. It's absolutely fine. It's really hard to do. It's about building this imaginative muscle, right? This capacity to actually think through what preferable alternative futures in the plural could be. Because it's quite easy to imagine where things start to go wrong because we're surrounded by narratives. So you can see Jeroen and I come from similar kinds of backgrounds, putting up a bunch of different books to talk to the discussions that are being having. And these are actually also movies. Don't Look Up, Day After Tomorrow, Extrapolations, Mad Max, Fury Road. We're really good at telling stories about how things go wrong. Yeah, that's quite easy to imagine. Talking about post-apocalyptic futures where the disaster happened and then we built back afterwards, we're quite good at doing. Telling us ourselves the stories of the nice pathways that actually avoid disaster and get us to where we want is a much harder narrative that we actually start to tell. But that's really I think at the core of what we're going to be discussing this afternoon. And there's a reason that's really hard, and particularly in the sort of biodiversity loss, climate change, sustainability world that I come from, it's because these are the realities that we're surrounded by, right? Fires, floods, heat waves, hurricanes. This is the reality of the projected future of what is likely to occur if we don't enact the kinds of transformations that Idil was talking about earlier, right? And so there's a very real need for discussing what these pathways, if we don't change anything, could look like. And I avoid the term business as usual because historically we know that transformations is actually much more likely to be happening. So it's not what we know as going forward, but these ideas of projections, right, of what the impacts are from the practices that we have today is a very stark reality that we need, right? But in the face of these challenges, can we imagine the types of futures, the places that we do want to go. And this is a quote attributed to Lao Tzu. It probably wasn't actually him that said it, but if you don't change direction, you're going to land up where you're heading. Right? And I think that's very much the space that we're playing in when we're talking particularly around climate change. And this is also building on that link to the preposterous, right? That Dato's second law of the future, that any useful idea of the future should appear to be ridiculous. And sort of, I really love building off that and sort of always come back to this idea of like, if it's ridiculous, I'm testing that imaginative capacity to its extent, right? It's actually sort of thinking through, you are challenging the power of the present, right? Those who have power over the present, if you're able to actually sort of come up with some more ridiculous, slightly preposterous ideas, as long as it's not about housewives ordering food. And so in the context, why have we been doing this? So there's been a lot of talk around the IPCC, climate change, sort of projections, but the world that I operate largely in is actually around biodiversity, and around how we have this really beautiful 2050 vision for living in harmony with nature, right, that we've actually agreed to. So we've got the Kunming Global Biodiversity Framework, where by 2050 biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and widely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefits essential for all people. Sounds great. Again, what does it look like? What does that world look like when we close our eyes? And I can tell you that every single person in this room would be imagining something different, actually, in terms of what that future looks like. And that level of diversity is also something to be appreciated and captured, that it's not about a singular target endpoint that we're trying to achieve, but holding that plurality can be quite uncomfortable, right? So we need to build up multiple skills. We're building this capacity to imagine, we're holding to this idea of the ridiculous, and we're also recognizing plurality, right? But that's not a very safe space for policy, for decision making, that one sort of, that's the target, that's the number, this is how I'm going to get there, right? So it actually forces us, coming back to what you were saying, to break down some of those social constructs of how we actually start planning to take all of this into account. So in the biodiversity space, we inherited, as most environmental sort of modeling does, the shared socioeconomic pathways. And you're laughing in the background there that I've got this up. And this is a really useful set of potential futures that were about challenges to adaptation, challenges to mitigation, middle of the road. We have one sustainability pathway where we overcome both those challenges, and then three sort of really problematic in different ways types of futures. But we were locked in to this way of thinking about the future, right? There was only one option that was actually getting us somewhere sustainable, right? SSP1. But that was still bad for biodiversity, right? It didn't take marginalization, it didn't take global inequality fundamentally into account. And we were very much locked into this from a modeling perspective, right? So from the numbers that were going into reports, into these assessment reports, into how decisions were being made across the globe, into the set of 5 narratives of how the future could play out. And so again, not that these are problematic, but the fact that you only have one set, right, is detracting from the plurality of options of what could be there, but also unpacking that really important bottom left-hand corner of what sustainability actually means. What is the aspirational, desirable future that we're trying to achieve? And according to whom? And according to whom where? Right? So that's sort of really the focus. And so IPES went on you wanted to take a photo? There we go. And nature wasn't a focus in this. And so as the IPES task force, following the assessment report that we published in 2016, we went through a phase of developing what's become known as the Nature Futures Framework. It was participatory. Trying to do participatory futures work at the global level is not something I would encourage anyone to try and do. And it's actually been subsequent work around multiple local and regional level interventions that we've been able to strengthen it. But ultimately, we came up with this framework that was negotiated with governments. So it sort of started from the image on the left and became sort of this image on the right, which is about recognizing that actually, if we're going to talk about aspirational futures, if we're going to talk about living in harmony with nature by 2050, we need to recognize that we hold diverse values for nature, and that sometimes we emphasize instrumental values, getting food, for example, over potentially cultural values, relational values sometimes, or intrinsic values. But that all of these are important, and that our numbers, our metrics, things we measure, tend to emphasize some values that can be quantified more easily than others. But that should not mean that that space is ignored. And then what was really interesting, and there's a very strong emphasis on indigenous and local knowledge in cooperation with an IPES, is understanding that actually, in practice, these are all messy underpinning mental models, knowledge systems, right? Which is I kind of call it the NFF and LSD. Looks a little bit crazy on the left, but it's about the messy intersection, and nothing is as nicely delineated as we like to put into our models. But there is still some sort of reference to that we can hold. And so we went on a journey and we were like, okay, we've got this new framework now. Can we come up with some of these alternative futures that we could aspire towards in different places with different people around the world that could help fill in a little bit of what that sustainability target normative space is? And so we did that. These are some of the images that you can see, distracting, so you can stop listening to what I'm saying if you want. We worked a lot with artists. We worked a lot with speculative fiction writers. And you can see that I don't need to say anything. You can look at these images and get a sense of what everyone was talking about, what they were aspiring towards. So we've got the high seas in the middle. We've got the mangrove coastal systems in Benin and Togo, the demilitarized zone in North Korea. We've got coral reef systems. We've got Europe. We've got Malawi and the Barotse cultural landscape in Zambia. Just as some examples of, in discussion, what are those elements? What are those sort of endpoints that people actually do aspire towards? And there's a lot of intersection around them, right? We do largely aspire towards similar things. They just manifest in very different ways in different parts of the world. How we did this, an imaginative, creative, inclusive, participatory process. There's sort of written a lot about that, but it's really about, we were talking about the who, right? The power, the people behind this. So who you have in the room discussing these things matters. And I was a bit flippant when I said trying to do a participatory process at the global level is virtually impossible. But you can reach out and try and get a diverse group of people, never representative, but a diverse group of perspectives, and more so those that have been marginalized from the dominant view that has tended to organize and construct how we think about what an aspirational future is going forward. And this sort of ties in a little bit into the decolonial futures work that we've been emphasizing. I'm sort of trying to think through how does that colonization of the past influence our perceptions of the present? And can we break through that in order to imagine a future that hasn't actually been colonized? And I'll come to that at the end because it's a lot hard. I don't think we've solved the problem yet, but I think it's one of the breakthroughs I think we really need to start getting our head around from a methodological as well as an implementation process. But yeah, so these are some of the people that have been involved in these visioning processes. And so it's not just me. There are a lot of faces and geographies behind them. So just some examples, again, as I said, the artwork has been really important in sort of how we describe these types of features. And here you can see within the triangle, I was mentioning the different values for nature. You have intrinsic value for nature in the top left, which is sort of not emphasizing humans. It's that nature can actually exist for itself without having human interference. You've got the cultural, the more relational one on the right, nature is culture, and you have a nature for society vision over here. So you can see how they link in with each other. This was to inform the BBNJ, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty that has recently come into force. The demilitarized zone in Korea, fascinating process, thinking through how actually an area of the world that had been completely sort of not had human influence on it because of military reasons, one of the longest standing conflicts in the world. Could it be a seed of peace, right? Could you actually think of what they call of ecological peace as a way of starting to thinking through futures in the Korean Peninsula that weren't separating North and South Korea, that actually had these deep connections, starting from an ecological connector. And would we be able to bring the tiger back? There are lots of narratives and myths around. They talk about smoking when tigers would smoke, right? As a common phrase. And thinking through, yeah, what does a restored, ecological, peaceful Korea look like? These are some of the images from the African Futures projects. Again, looking at parts of the world that generally have this dark hole, right, of dystopian, how everything can go wrong. Sort of, if you guys have watched not so recent anymore, but movies around the prawns in Johannesburg, which is where I'm from. Thinking through, actually, these could be the seeds of much more preferable futures. Actually, you can be aspirational on the continent. You can think of African futurism as one of the tools that we have to think through some of these alternatives. And these are some of the discussions that we've been having with as local stakeholders. And then finally, the coral reefs. So this is really interesting because this is in the context of, I'm sure many people have been hearing, climate, Earth system tipping points. Like, have we actually just reached a climate threshold where we're going to lose our coral reefs? And that's a really dystopian, difficult narrative, particularly for the billions of people that are actually relying directly on functioning coral reef ecosystems. So was there a level of agency in these discussions with the reality of climate? We have climate modelers in the room with us quite often, that we could think of, okay, let's not completely give up on them yet. We may not be talking about specific mitigation efforts, right? We still have a global climate agenda we need to manage, but what are some of the local things that we could do, right? Improved water quality, thinking through alternative energy systems, thinking through different types of cultural practices, right? That could still ensure some level of a functional coral reef. And here it was interesting because we definitely had a bit of a collapse and then build back onto a preferable narrative in the pathways. And so that brings me to the last part of the talk, which is how we had this big gap in aspirational futures. We were locked into SSP1. We've started to do better at coming up with some of these more aspirational stories, right, around what desirable futures could look like. But then we come back to well, how do we get there, right? If we're actually looking at target-seeking, normative, if I'm not going to have one more person coming to me like, that's a great story, but it's impossible, right? We're never going to get there. Coming back to what Ida was hearing also in her intervention. So it's like, okay, we can come up with these pathways. We can actually give a good story of how we might be able to get there. A variety of different tools we've used, both the Three Horizons framework, but increasingly the X-curve. And I really like this quote by Roa Benjamin that talks about, which is fundamentally at the heart of this, remembering to imagine and craft the worlds you cannot live without, just as you dismantle the ones you cannot live within, right? So when we're talking about transformations, transformative change, these radical reconfigurations of our societies, economies, politics, etc., we're talking about letting go of the current system, right? Because we can't have transformations if we hold on to what's currently locking us in place on these unsustainable, inequitable trajectories as we start to imagine and build where we do want to go, right? And that holds conflict, right, within it. So we're not shying away from the fact that this is fundamentally about different ideologies, different politics, different power plays coming together, right? And we need to recognize that these are parts of the mechanism, but that we can still actually action some of these. And so I threw this set of slides in really quickly because we've had talk of Musk, talk of space, talk of all of these other different futures. Peter Thiel, I actually managed to, thanks to yours quote him in a recent paper, basically saying let the tech bros sort of not take over some of these narratives. Let's think through what living in harmony with nature could actually be. But this was a process that we did in Succinct, which was a synthesis project, landed up actually being a game. So you can go on to survivethecentury.net and play this. There is a narrative, a storyline where you do survive the century and it goes quite well. And I'm going to give you a flash of what that is. Not everyone, it took me a while to remember what this was. But we talk about sort of holding CEOs to account, right? We talk about actually looking about places in the world where we have innovation and creativity that tends to be discarded. We then move into thinking through what are the types of food systems, agricultural systems, right? And this is by 2030. And we had a background climate model happening inroads in the background where we were actually sort of showing what the climate impact of this was. Talk about the role of representative epistemic governance, right? Indigenous peoples and local communities included in global governance systems. The obituary to capitalism that always has to come, I think, probably before the 2070s, actually, if the latest global justice report is anything to go by. And then you start to see the benefits, the climate benefits, right? That, by 2080, you could actually have a climate trajectory where you started to see the sea ice returning, right? What you do need, if you're not going to employ any engineering, climate engineering interventions, including CDR, is you will need a volcano in about the 2070s in order to bring the climate back to 1.5 by end of the century. But if you give yourselves overshoot, which we've now entered and back, you don't need the volcano. And yeah, then by 2090, we're sort of starting to talk about really seeing the implications of environmental restoration. And so that's a little story. There's also some really interesting ones about how when a lot of the rich people go to Mars, do you invest in a global military system so that when they want to come back, once you've sold everything, you can keep them away. But that's I think, an aperitivo conversation. And so finally, we've been trying to take some of these narratives and bring some of the modeling science to the table. So I'm part of the Earth Commission. We've been working on trying to quantify what the safe and just Earth system space actually is, right? Give some numbers for what it does actually look like to live both sustainably but also justly on the planet. And so we've reached most of the Earth system boundaries. I think we're all quite aware of that. But understanding, okay, how do we get those yellow dots back into the green space, right? Also knowing that they're all interconnected with each other, right? That we're not just talking about one singular system. And we've also added the ocean into that. So with the coral reefs, I was mentioning we had a pathways discussion. There were 3 different narratives, 3 different ways, storylines of how we might go back into a safe and just space for coral reef systems. This is the visions have been published. Ignacio, my postdoc, is working on the pathways paper now. I also had a master's student looking at the very local level at Monterrey in Mexico on what would a safe and just future for Monterrey look like, and what are the different types of pathways that you could use to get there. So she also did a participatory process there. As you can see that you've got different time frames in terms of when you are able to achieve some boundaries versus others, right? Depending on what pathway you actually choose, and then how you would start to model them. These weren't quantified. These were just thought experiments. But we are working at the moment to do quantifications at the global level. And these are the final slides. This is what we're working on in terms of using strategies to reduce pressure on the Earth system to ensure decent living standards for all, so bringing sort of pressure down, but also ensuring that everyone has equitable access to different needs, and then thinking through scale. Do we think of a global, more homogeneous kind of future, or is it a future that's much more heterogeneous, sort of bottom up, where everyone sort of has different pockets of organization? We developed 4 narratives. They've been collapsed into 2, sort of this more top-down, more bottom-up one. You do lose context every time that you do quantify something. So that's why we're emphasizing the importance of the narratives before. And this is what our modeling teams are currently putting into practice. So with the integrated assessment model that were also mentioned earlier, which are constrained in many ways, but are still useful if you use them just as tools of thinking through the future in ways that we're not necessarily able to do ourselves. But the most interesting part is both what happens to the Earth system, but also what happens to our social systems. If we're looking at what would we think of as an acceptable level of inequality in the future, right? And so you can actually think through, well, right now we know that we've got a vast number of people on the left-hand side without actually access to basic living standard, decent living standards. And we've got those few billionaires, right, sitting perversely at the far end, right? like how much do you need to start bringing people into what we're calling this high value model, which would, from a resilience perspective, probably should be low, and how would you distribute people across that? And this is an important thought experiment, right? That we can use, we can do in a participatory way. We can also use models to be like, okay, well, let's just literally convert. If you bring all of these up, then you need to bring the equivalent level of consumption down from the top. So this is something that we're playing around with at the moment, and this is sort of that target of that safe and just corridor, and I'm more than happy to talk through it afterwards in questions because I am running out of time, I know, probably. Yeah, so stories, different ways of thinking about the future. We've got the Ministry for the Future, Kim Stanley Robertson, that was mentioned. I had a lovely lunch with him last week. He's thinking of his next book. I think everyone is very excited about that. But we also did this anthology in Malawi of reimagining the Mombera Kingdom in northern Malawi and like what that could look like based on this participatory process. And I said that the challenge that we still had around decolonial thinking, right, which is tying these arrays past, these understandings of time, and we didn't want to go left to right. We wanted to go bottom up. We wanted to think of this as an entangled time tree, referencing a baobab, of these multiple presents that we inhabit. We're good at projecting futures, the futures cone, sort of thinking of the future sort of going forward. But there are many ways around the world of Sankofa, for example, of going forward whilst thinking about the ancestors, whilst looking backwards, which is the middle. There's a lot of circular time thinking, right, that we're not very good at holding when we think about futures in very Western contexts. And can we do better at that? And also recognizing these deep ties to the past. So thank you very much. The Economist already said it in 2011, of all the things to quote, that we've changed the way the world works, and now we have to change the way we think about it too. Thank you very much.